The morning my parents came to claim my house, they stood on the front porch, smiling like they had just won the lottery. It was a sight that would have been comical if it hadn't been so terrifyingly delusional. My father stood there with a folder tucked under his arm, his posture rigid and authoritative, like a general arriving to inspect the troops. My mother carried a tray of store-bought muffins, balancing it carefully as if this were some kind of polite Sunday visit, a casual drop-in between neighbors rather than a hostile takeover. And then there was my younger brother, Jason. He leaned against his truck in the driveway, grinning that specific grin he used to wear when we were kids, the one that said he knew he was about to get away with something, the look of a boy who had never faced a real consequence in his life. But the smile on Jason's face disappeared about 10 minutes later, because by the time they opened the door, the house was empty. There was no furniture, no dishes, no photographs on the walls, nothing but bare drywall and the quiet, haunting echo of their own footsteps. The air didn't smell like coffee or the lemon cleaner I used every Saturday. It just smelled like dust and finality. And that was the moment they realized something was terribly, terribly wrong. But to understand how things got to that silent, empty room, you have to go back 3 days earlier. Back to the day that was supposed to be the happiest of my life. Back to my wedding. I got married on a warm Saturday afternoon in late May. It was the kind of Ohio spring day that feels like a promise kept, a blue sky stretching out forever, a light breeze drifting through the open windows of the little church on Maple Street, carrying the scent of fresh grass and blooming lilacs. I was 38 years old, and standing there in that church, I felt something I had spent my entire life chasing, the feeling that something truly belonged to me. My husband, Daniel, stood at the front of the church wearing a dark suit that didn't quite hide the grease stains under his fingernails from the garage. He had tried scrubbing them that morning, using that industrial cleaner that smells like chemicals and effort, but years of fixing engines have a way of settling into your skin, becoming part of who you are. I liked that about him. Daniel wasn't polished or flashy. He wasn't the kind of man who would sweep you off your feet with poetry or grand gestures. He was steady. He was the kind of man who would change your oil at midnight just so you wouldn't have a problem in the morning. At our age, after years of grinding through adulthood, steady means more than fireworks. Steady means safety. I worked as a nurse at Riverside Methodist Hospital in Columbus. I had been there for almost 15 years. It was a life of long shifts, night rotations, missed holidays, and the kind of job that leaves your feet aching and your lower back throbbing, but your heart full. It was hard work, but it was honest work. Daniel owned a small auto repair shop on the west side. Nothing fancy, just 3 bays, a worn-out coffee machine that never quite worked right, and a loyal roster of customers who trusted him because he never lied to them about what their cars needed. We met because his mother was one of my patients. That's the kind of love story people our age understand. Not dramatic, not a fairy tale, just 2 tired people who found kindness in each other when the world was asking them to give everything they had. But my parents never really saw it that way. To them, Daniel was just a mechanic, and in their eyes, a mechanic was simply not impressive enough for their daughter. They had this vision of who I should be with, someone in a suit, someone with a corner office, someone who looked successful on paper, even if that paper didn't reflect reality. Still, to their credit, they came to the wedding. They sat in the second row, stiff and quiet, like they were attending a business conference rather than a celebration of love. My mother wore a pale blue dress that looked like it had been chosen more for a funeral than a wedding, her face set in a mask of polite tolerance. My father spent most of the ceremony staring at his watch, checking the time as if he had somewhere more important to be. And Jason, well, Jason showed up late. He always did. Jason was 3 years younger than me, but you would think he was the one who had carried the weight of the world on his shoulders. That's how my parents treated him. Growing up, Jason was the sensitive one. He was the one who needed extra help, extra understanding, extra forgiveness, and, most importantly, extra money. When Jason wrecked his first car at 19, totaling it while speeding, my parents bought him another one the very next week. When Jason dropped out of community college because he said the professors didn't get him, they said school just wasn't his path and coddled his ego. When Jason's landscaping business failed after 2 summers because he spent more time networking at the bar than actually mowing lawns, they blamed the economy. Meanwhile, I worked double shifts at the hospital to pay my way through nursing school. I ate instant noodles for years. I drove a car with a cracked windshield because I couldn't afford the deductible. Not once did my parents offer to help with tuition. Not once did they ask if I needed a break. But that was just the way things were in our family. Jason needed support. I needed to be strong. At least, that's what I told myself for most of my life. It was the narrative I had been fed since childhood, and I had swallowed it hook, line, and sinker. The wedding itself was simple. A small church ceremony followed by dinner at a family-owned restaurant downtown. Nothing extravagant, just friends, coworkers, and a few relatives who actually cared. Daniel's family filled the room with laughter and loud toasts, hugging us until our ribs ached. My parents sat quietly at their table, picking at their food, looking around the room with mild disdain. Jason spent most of the evening at the bar, ordering top-shelf liquor on my tab, laughing loudly with people he didn't know. But I didn't let it bother me, because for once the day wasn't about them. It wasn't about their approval or their disappointment. It was about Daniel and me. When Daniel and I danced our first dance, swaying to a slow song in the middle of the makeshift dance floor, I remember thinking how peaceful everything felt. It felt like the long years of working, saving, and building something stable had finally led somewhere good. And that feeling was mostly because of the house. That little house meant everything to me. It was a modest two-bedroom place with a small porch and white siding that needed repainting every few years. It wasn't fancy. It wasn't in the trendiest neighborhood, but I bought it myself. 10 years of overtime shifts, 10 years of careful budgeting, 10 years of saying no to vacations and new cars and fancy dinners. 10 years of my life traded for those 4 walls. When I signed the closing papers, I sat in my car afterward and I cried. I didn't cry because the house was beautiful. I cried because it meant I had done something on my own. It was the only proof I had that I existed outside of my family's expectations. It was mine. And now, Daniel and I were starting our life there together. We were happy. But 3 days after the wedding, while we were still riding that high, still unpacking boxes of gifts and arguing playfully about where to put the toaster, the doorbell rang. I remember wiping my hands on a dish towel, humming a song from the reception and walking to the door. And there they were, my parents. Jason standing behind them, shifting his weight from foot to foot. My father holding that folder. My mother with the muffins. "Emily," my mother said with a tight smile that didn't reach her eyes. "We need to talk." Daniel stepped into the hallway behind me, sensing the shift in the air immediately. "Everything okay?" he asked, his voice low. My father didn't even acknowledge him. He just walked past me into the living room like he owned the place, his shoes clicking on the hardwood floor I had refinished myself. Jason followed, looking around the house with a new kind of interest, an appraising look, like a buyer at an auction. My mother set the muffins on the table, a peace offering for a war she was about to start. Then my father opened the folder. Inside was a contract. He slid it across the table toward me with a heavy thud. "Sign this," he said. No preamble. No, "how are you?" Just a command. I looked down at the document. My heart hammered against my ribs. It was a property transfer agreement. My house, signed over to Jason. I blinked, my mind struggling to process the words. "I don't understand." Jason cleared his throat, stepping forward. "I'm starting a new business," he said. His voice slick with the confidence of a conman. "And I need a place to live while I get it going." My mother nodded quickly, her hands fluttering nervously. "Your brother needs a place to land, Emily, a foundation." My father folded his arms, his face hard. "You owe this family, Emily." The words hung in the air like a bad smell, suffocating the room. I looked at Daniel. He didn't say anything. He just watched. He knew me well enough to know I needed a moment to process. I turned back to my parents. "Why would I give Jason my house?" I asked, my voice trembling slightly. My father sighed, rolling his eyes as if I were a child asking why the sky was blue. "Because he needs it more than you. You have Daniel, you have a job, Jason has nothing." Jason avoided my eyes, staring at the floor. My mother leaned forward and placed her hand over mine. Her skin was dry and cold. "You've always been the strong one," she whispered. I felt something old and familiar tighten in my chest. That same sentence. The one I had heard my entire life. "You're the strong one." I heard it when I was 7 and Jason broke my toy and I was told to let it go. I heard it when I was 16 and Jason totaled the family car and I had to drive him everywhere. I heard it when I was 25 and working 3 jobs while Jason found himself. You're the strong one, which really meant you're the one who gives things up. You're the one whose needs don't matter. I looked down at the contract again. Then I asked the question that had been waiting inside me for 30 years. If I sign this, will it finally be enough? My parents didn't hesitate. They didn't even have to think about it. Yes, my father said, and that was when I picked up the pen. The pen felt heavier than it should have. It was just an ordinary ballpoint, cheap plastic blue ink. But as I held it above that contract, it carried the weight of 38 years. 38 years of birthdays where Jason got the bigger cake slice. 38 years of Christmas mornings where his gifts filled half the living room while mine fit neatly under the tree. 38 years of being the afterthought, the workhorse, the bank. I glanced once more at Daniel. He stood quietly by the kitchen counter, arms folded loosely. His expression wasn't angry. It wasn't confused either. It was calm, almost expectant. That was Daniel. He never rushed into other people's battles, but he never left my side either. He trusted me to handle this. The room was so quiet I could hear the hum of the refrigerator behind us. My father tapped the table impatiently. Well, he said. Jason shifted in his chair. Come on, Em, he muttered. It's just temporary. Temporary? Jason had been living temporarily for almost 20 years. Temporary jobs, temporary apartments, temporary business ideas. Nothing ever stuck because he never had to make it stick. My mother squeezed my hand. You've done so well for yourself, she said softly. Your brother just needs a little help. You can be the hero here. I looked down at the contract again. Property transfer agreement. My name, Jason's name. Legal language that would erase 10 years of my life with one signature. But what my parents didn't realize was that something inside me had already changed. Getting married had done that. Because when you spend your whole life being the responsible one, you start believing responsibility means sacrifice. But Daniel had spent the last 2 years teaching me something different. Responsibility also means protecting what you've built. Responsibility means knowing when you are being used. I set the tip of the pen on the paper and signed. My father leaned forward immediately, grabbing the contract before the ink was even dry, his eyes gleaming with victory. Jason let out a low whistle. Well, he said, that was easier than I thought. My mother smiled, relief spreading across her face like sunlight. Oh, honey, she said, patting my arm. You won't regret this. This is for the family. I didn't answer. Daniel walked over and took the contract from my father's hands, glancing at it briefly. He studied the signature, then looked at me. Our eyes met for a split second. A silent communication passed between us. Then he nodded and handed it back. Looks official, Daniel said, his voice perfectly neutral. My father tucked the folder under his arm again, triumphant. We'll come by tomorrow morning, he said. Jason will need the keys. We can start moving his things in then. Jason stood up and looked around the house again, this time with a sense of ownership. Yeah, he said. I'll probably repaint the place. The living room is too neutral. Repaint, the word hit me strangely. I had spent 2 summers painting those walls. Every brushstroke applied after 12-hour hospital shifts, carefully tapping the trim, choosing the exact shade of white to make the room feel bigger. Jason walked toward the door first. My parents followed. My mother paused in the doorway. You did the right thing, she said gently. A mother knows. Then they were gone. The house fell quiet again. For a long moment, Daniel and I didn't move. The silence was heavy, but it wasn't sad. Finally, Daniel exhaled slowly. Well, he said, that was something. I sank into one of the kitchen chairs. You're not going to ask why I did it, I asked, looking up at him. Daniel walked over to the sink and poured himself a glass of water. Nope. He took a sip. Because you didn't just give away your house, I know you. I looked up, tears finally pricking my eyes. You noticed. He smiled slightly. I noticed a few things. I noticed you didn't read the fine print. I noticed you signed the deed, but you didn't sign away the equity loan we took out last year. I noticed you signed your half. That was when I felt the tension leave my shoulders for the first time all afternoon. Daniel pulled out the chair across from me and sat down. You ready? He asked. For what? For the part where we disappear. The rest of that evening moved quietly. Not frantic, not chaotic, just deliberate. Daniel and I had talked about something like this once before. Not this exact situation, but the pattern behind it. Families like mine don't suddenly change overnight. The expectations just keep growing. More sacrifice, more responsibility, more giving until there's nothing left. And Daniel had asked me a simple question months ago. What happens when you finally say no? I didn't know the answer then. I was too scared to find out, but now I did. You walk away. Around 6:00 that evening, Daniel backed his pickup truck into the driveway. We started loading boxes. Most of our belongings had never been fully unpacked after the wedding anyway. Kitchen items, suitcases, clothes. Daniel worked quietly, carrying furniture out piece by piece. The couch where I had spent countless nights reading medical journals. The dining table where we had our first meal as a married couple. The bedroom dresser. I took down the framed photos from the living room wall. One of my nursing school graduation. One of Daniel and me at the county fair last summer. And one small picture of the house the day I bought it, standing there with a sold sign in the yard, me beaming with a key in my hand. I slipped that one into my purse. By 9:00 p.m., the rooms were empty. The house echoed when we walked through it, a hollow, lonely sound. Daniel checked his watch. "You sure you want to do this tonight?" he asked. I nodded. "If we wait until tomorrow, my parents will show up early. They'll want to supervise the transfer." "I can't be here for that," he shrugged. "Fair point." We took one final walk through the house together. The bedroom, the kitchen, the porch. The porch was always my favorite spot. I used to sit out there after long shifts at the hospital, drinking iced tea and watching the neighborhood quiet down. Across the street, Mr. Henderson watered his roses every evening at sunset. Tonight he was doing the same thing. He waved when he saw us. "Moving already," he called out. "Just visiting family for a while," I lied softly. He chuckled. "Newlyweds, makes sense." "Have a good trip." Daniel locked the front door behind us. Then he handed me the keys. I looked at them for a moment, the metal cool in my palm, then I dropped them into the mailbox. Jason would find them there in the morning. Daniel climbed into the driver's seat of the truck. I got in beside him. "Where to?" he asked. I looked down the quiet street, the streetlights flickering on. "South," I said. "South." He started the engine. The truck rolled slowly away from the curb. I didn't look back. At 7:00 the next morning, my parents pulled into the driveway with Jason. They were smiling. Jason stepped out of his truck first, rubbing his hands together. "Well," he said, "let's see my new place." My father walked up the porch steps and tried the doorknob. Locked. "Emily must have left the keys," my mother said, looking around. Jason opened the mailbox. Inside were the keys. He unlocked the door and the three of them stepped inside. The smile vanished from Jason's face almost instantly. The house was empty, completely empty. No furniture, no appliances, no curtains. Even the light bulbs were gone. Jason walked slowly into the living room, his footsteps echoing loudly. "What the hell?" he muttered. My father frowned, looking around. "This doesn't make sense." "Where is everything?" My mother walked into the kitchen, her heels clicking on the bare linoleum. The refrigerator was gone, so was the stove. "Frank," she whispered. Jason noticed something on the kitchen counter, a single envelope. He picked it up. Inside was a letter. He read the first line out loud, and suddenly his voice sounded very small. "Dear Jason," he said slowly, "about the house." Jason's hands were shaking when he unfolded the letter. My parents stood close behind him in the empty kitchen, the three of them surrounded by bare walls and silence. The house no longer smelled like coffee or laundry soap or the lemon cleaner I used every Saturday morning. It smelled like dust. Jason cleared his throat and began reading. "Dear Jason, about the house." He stopped for a moment and looked around again like the words might somehow explain the emptiness. My father frowned. "Well," he said impatiently, "keep reading." Jason swallowed. "Before you start repainting the place, there are a few things you should know." My mother pressed a hand to her chest. "Frank," she whispered. Jason continued, his voice gaining a tremor. "The contract you brought me transferred my ownership of the property. That part is true." My father nodded stiffly. "Of course it did." Jason kept reading. "But what you may not have realized is that I only owned half of the house." Silence, the kind of silence that falls when a storm is about to break. Jason blinked. "What?" he said. My father stepped forward. "Read the rest." Jason continued, his voice rising in panic. "The other half of the house was legally owned by Daniel. When we married, he became co-owner through the refinancing agreement we signed last year." My father's face turned pale. "That's not possible," he muttered. "She bought that house before she met him." Jason's voice wavered as he read the next line. "Yesterday afternoon, Daniel finalized the sale of his half of the property." My mother grabbed the edge of the counter to steady herself. "Sold it to who?" she whispered. Jason looked down at the page again. "To a property investment company based in Cincinnati." My father snatched the letter from Jason's hands. Let me see that. He read the next paragraph himself, his lips tightening with every word. The company will be contacting you shortly to discuss the terms of shared ownership. According to Ohio law, they now have the right to request either a buyout or a full property sale. Jason stared at him. Wait, what does that mean? My father looked up slowly. It means, he said through clenched teeth, you don't own the house. Jason laughed nervously. Sure I do, Emily signed it over. Half of it, my father snapped. My mother sank to the floor. The only piece of furniture left in the house was the memory of what used to be there. But why would she do this? She asked weakly. Jason rubbed his face. This doesn't make any sense. My father flipped the letter over and kept reading. By the time you receive this letter, Daniel and I will be on the road. We've decided to start our life somewhere else. My father slammed the letter down on the counter. That ungrateful girl. Jason paced across the empty living room. So what now? He said. We just talk to the company and buy their half. My father hesitated. How much money do you have, Jason? Jason stopped packing. Well, none right now, but once the business starts. My father cut him off. Exactly. My mother looked up. Frank, surely there's some way to fix this. At that exact moment, Jason's phone buzzed. He glanced down at the screen. Unknown number, he answered. Hello. The voice on the other end sounded cheerful and professional. Good morning. Is this Mr. Jason Carter? Yeah. My name is Melissa Grant. I'm calling from Hamilton Property Investments. We recently acquired partial ownership of a property at 118 Oak Ridge Lane. Jason looked around the empty house again. That was fast, he muttered. My father leaned closer, trying to listen. Yes, Jason said into the phone, that's the house. Wonderful, the woman replied. We'd like to discuss the next steps in resolving the shared ownership situation. Jason forced a laugh. Sure, that shouldn't be a problem. Well, she said pleasantly, there are two options available under Ohio property law. Jason waited. First, you may purchase our share of the property. Our valuation department has estimated that half ownership is worth approximately $160,000. Jason nearly dropped the phone. How much? Alternatively, she continued calmly, if a buyout isn't possible, we can initiate a partition sale. That means the property would be sold on the open market and the proceeds divided. Jason stared at my father. Dad. My father's jaw tightened. Jason spoke into the phone again. Yeah, we might need a little time to think about that. Of course, the woman said. We'll send the paperwork this afternoon. The call ended. Jason slowly lowered the phone. $160,000, he whispered. My father paced across the room. That girl planned this, he said. My mother shook her head weakly. No, Emily wouldn't do something like that. Jason laughed bitterly. Well, she just did. Meanwhile, Daniel and I were already 3 hours south of Columbus. The highway stretched ahead of us in long gray lines, disappearing into the Kentucky hills. I sat quietly in the passenger seat, watching farmland roll past. For the first hour, neither of us spoke. Then Daniel glanced over. You okay? I thought about that for a moment, and surprisingly, I was. I think so, I said. He nodded. Good. We drove another few miles before he spoke again. You know, they're probably losing their minds right now. I let out a small laugh. Jason definitely is, Daniel grinned. Your brother always did expect the easy road. I watched the highway signs slide by, Cincinnati, Lexington, Nashville, places I had only ever passed through before. Do you feel guilty? Daniel asked gently. I considered that question carefully. For most of my life, the answer would have been yes. I would have felt the heavy, suffocating weight of obligation. But something had shifted. No, I said finally. He nodded again. That's healthy. We drove in comfortable silence for a while. Then Daniel asked the question that mattered most. So where do you want to land? I looked out the window at the green hills rising in the distance. Your hometown, I said. There. Yeah, he smiled. You're going to like it there. Quiet, I asked. Very. I leaned my head back against the seat. Quiet sounded perfect. Because for the first time in my life, I wasn't running from something. I was choosing where to go. And back in Columbus, Ohio, my parents were just beginning to understand something they had never expected. For 38 years, they believed Emily Carter would always sacrifice for the family. But that morning, they finally learned what happened when the strong one stopped saying yes. The call from the investment company arrived faster than my parents expected. Jason told me about it later, but I can imagine the scene almost perfectly. My father packing across the empty living room, his phone pressed to his ear, demanding to speak to a manager. My mother sitting at the kitchen counter, twisting her wedding ring nervously, staring at the bare walls. Jason staring at the floor like the house had personally betrayed him. Because that's the thing about people who expect life to hand them something. They never imagine the bill might come due. 2 days after we left Ohio, Daniel and I crossed into Tennessee just after sunrise. The hills were soft and green, covered with trees that seemed to stretch forever. The road curved gently through small towns where diners opened early and pickup trucks filled the parking lots. Daniel rolled down the window and breathed in the cool morning air. "Smells like home," he said. I smiled. Back in Columbus, mornings usually smelled like traffic and hospital disinfectant. Here, it smelled like damp grass and wood smoke. Daniel's hometown was a place called Franklin Hollow, about 40 minutes outside Nashville. Not big enough to appear on most maps, but big enough for a grocery store, a church, and a diner where everyone seemed to know each other. His parents had passed years earlier, but his older sister lived nearby with her family. She had been calling him for months. "Come back," she always said. "You work too hard in that city." Now, for the first time, Daniel was listening. We pulled into town around 8:00 in the morning. The diner on Main Street had a red neon sign that blinked open. "Breakfast?" Daniel asked. "Absolutely." Inside, the place smelled like bacon and fresh coffee. An older woman behind the counter looked up and smiled warmly. "Well, I'll be," she said. "Daniel Harper." Daniel laughed. "Morning, Linda." She came around the counter and hugged him. "Thought you forgot about us city folks." "Never," he said. Linda looked at me. "And who's this?" Daniel put an arm around my shoulders. "My wife." Her eyebrows shot up. "Well now," she said, smiling wider. "Congratulations." We sat at a booth by the window. Linda poured us coffee. "Word travels fast in small towns," she said. "Your sister told half the county you might come back." Daniel chuckled. "That sounds about right." As we ate eggs and toast, something inside me slowly began to relax. For years, my life had been measured in hospital shifts, bills, responsibilities, and family obligations. Everything felt heavy. But sitting there in that quiet diner, things felt lighter, simpler, like life had suddenly given me permission to breathe. Back in Ohio, the situation was becoming much less peaceful. Jason called the investment company again that afternoon. This time, my father listened on speaker. The same calm voice answered. "Mr. Carter, we sent the paperwork this morning." Jason ran a hand through his hair. "Yeah, about that, we might need some time." "How much time?" the woman asked. Jason glanced at my father. "A few months, maybe." There was a short pause. "I'm afraid that won't be possible," she replied politely. Jason frowned. "What do you mean?" "The company typically allows 30 days for buyout negotiations." My father leaned toward the phone. "This is Frank Carter, Jason's father. This house belonged to our daughter. Surely you understand there's been some kind of family misunderstanding." The woman's voice remained calm. "Sir, our company legally purchased half ownership of the property. We have every right to pursue a resolution." Jason whispered under his breath. "This is insane." My father tried another approach. "Look," he said, lowering his voice. "We simply need time to gather the funds." "How much time?" she asked again. My father hesitated. "We're not sure." "I understand," she said gently. "However, without a buyout agreement, the next step would be a partition sale." Jason rubbed his temples. "What does that mean again?" "It means the house will be listed on the open market and sold." My father's face darkened. "And our share? You would receive half the proceeds." Jason laughed bitterly. "That's not the plan." "Unfortunately," she replied, "that's the law." The call ended. For several seconds, no one spoke. Finally, Jason kicked the kitchen cabinet. "This is Emily's fault." My mother flinched. "She wouldn't do this just to hurt us." Jason spun toward her. "Then why?" My father stared out the window. He didn't answer because deep down he already knew. Meanwhile, Daniel's sister had arranged for us to rent a small cottage outside town. It sat on 2 acres of land surrounded by tall oak trees. A white fence lined the driveway, and a narrow creek ran behind the property. The house was old but sturdy. 2 bedrooms, wood floors that creaked gently when you walked across them, and a wide porch with 2 rocking chairs. When I stepped onto that porch for the first time, I felt something I hadn't felt in years. Peace. Daniel set our bags inside. "Well," he said, stretching his arms. "What do you think?" I looked around at the quiet fields and distant hills. "I think," I said slowly, "this might be the first place I've ever lived that actually feels like home." He smiled. "I was hoping you'd say that." Later that afternoon, I called the community clinic in town. They needed a nurse. Small clinics always do. The doctor asked a few questions about my hospital experience. Then he said something simple. "When can you start?" I looked out the kitchen window at the trees swaying in the wind. "Next week," I said. When I hung up, Daniel was standing in the doorway. "You got the job?" "Yep," he grinned. "See, fresh start." I leaned against the counter. "Daniel." "Yeah." "Do you think my parents will ever understand why I did this?" He thought about that for a moment. "Maybe someday," he said. Then he added quietly, "But first, they're going to have to understand what happens when you push someone too far." And back in Ohio, that lesson was only beginning. Jason called me 4 days after the investment company sent their paperwork. I was standing in the small clinic in Franklin Hollow, learning where the supply cabinets were kept when my phone started buzzing in my pocket. The number looked familiar. Columbus area code. For a moment, I simply stared at the screen. Daniel, who was sitting in the waiting area filling out paperwork for the clinic's volunteer program, glanced up. "Your family?" he asked quietly. I nodded. He didn't tell me not to answer. Daniel had never been that kind of man. Instead, he just said, "Whatever you decide, I'm here." The phone kept ringing. Finally, I stepped outside onto the clinic's back porch and answered. "Hello." For a few seconds, Jason didn't say anything. Then his voice came through the line. "Emily?" "Yes." Another pause. "Where are you?" His voice sounded different than usual. Less cocky, less cert. "Why?" I asked. "Because Mom and Dad are freaking out." I leaned against the porch railing. "That sounds stressful." Jason let out a frustrated breath. "This isn't funny. I'm not laughing." There was silence again. Then Jason got straight to the point. "You need to fix this." I almost smiled. "Fix what?" "You know what," he snapped. "This whole house situation." The creek behind the clinic trickled quietly through the trees. I watched the water move over the rocks. "What exactly do you think I did, Jason?" I asked calmly. He scoffed. "You tricked us." "No," I said. "I signed the contract you gave me." "Yeah, but you set it up so the house would get sold." I sighed softly. "Jason, you asked me to give you my home because I owed the family." The words echoed across the quiet Tennessee yard. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then I asked him something I had wondered for years. "Why do you think that?" Jason hesitated. "Because that's just how things work." "No," I said gently. "That's how things worked for you." His voice dropped lower. "You always had it easier." I blinked. "Easier? You were the responsible one. Mom and Dad trusted you. They expected you to succeed." I let out a quiet laugh. "Jason, do you know how many extra shifts I worked to pay for nursing school?" "That's not the point." "It is the point." He didn't answer. I continued. "You wrecked 2 cars before you were 25. Mom and Dad bought both of them. That was different. You dropped out of college and they said school wasn't for everyone." Jason shifted uncomfortably on the other end of the line. "So what? You're punishing us now?" "No," I said. "I'm just not rescuing you." Jason exhaled sharply. "You know they're going to lose money on this." I thought about my parents sitting in that empty house, about the years of decisions that led to that moment. "They made their choices," I said quietly. Jason lowered his voice. "You could still stop this." "How?" "You could tell the company to back off. That's not how contracts work." He was silent again. Then he said something unexpected. "You know, this was Dad's idea." That caught my attention. "Really?" "Yeah," Jason said. "He's the one who said the house should stay in the family." I leaned against the railing. "And you didn't question it?" Jason sighed. "Honestly, I thought you'd argue." "Why?" "Because you always do." That was true. For most of my life, I had argued, defended myself, explained my choices, tried to prove I deserved fairness. But something had changed. "I didn't argue this time," I said softly. Jason sounded tired. "No kidding." A long pause stretched between us. Finally, he spoke again. "The company says we have 20 days left before they force the sale." "That sounds about right." "Dad tried talking to a lawyer and they said the contract is solid." I wasn't surprised. Daniel had been very careful. Jason's voice lowered even further. "Emily, we can't afford to buy the other half." The admission hung in the air. For the first time in my life, Jason sounded scared. "What do you want me to do?" I asked. "I don't know," he said quietly. "That's a first." Another pause. Then Jason said something I never expected to hear from him. "Mom's been crying." I closed my eyes. That still hurt. Despite everything, my mother's sadness still reached something inside me. But sadness doesn't erase responsibility. "I never wanted to hurt her," I said. "Too late." The creek water continued its steady rhythm behind me. "Jason," I said carefully, Did you ever stop to think how that contract made me feel? He didn't answer. You walked into my home 3 days after my wedding and told me I owed the family. His voice softened slightly. That wasn't supposed to happen like this. How was it supposed to happen? You sign the house over, I move in, everyone's happy. I shook my head. Except me. Jason let out a slow breath. I guess I never thought about that. For once, he sounded honest. Jason, I said, I didn't disappear because I wanted revenge. Then why? Because I needed a life that wasn't built on giving things up. He was quiet for several seconds. Then he asked a question that surprised me. Are you happy? I looked out at the Tennessee hills glowing in the afternoon sun. Yes, I said, and for the first time in a long while, that answer felt completely true. Jason exhaled. Well, I guess that's something. Before hanging up, he said one more thing. You know, Dad's never going to admit he was wrong. I thought about that. Then I replied calmly, he might have to. Because back in Ohio, the investment company had just listed the house for sale. And when the sign went up in the front yard, my parents finally understood that the consequences were real. The letter from my mother arrived 3 months after the house was sold. By then, summer had settled deep into Tennessee. The clinic kept me busy most days. Franklin Hollow wasn't a big town, but folks there worked hard and didn't always see a doctor as often as they should. High blood pressure, arthritis, diabetes, things that creep up on you quietly after years of living. Most of the patients were older farmers, retired mechanics, widows who had lived in the same house for 50 years. People who reminded me of the neighbors I grew up around in Ohio. People who understood that life doesn't always turn out the way you planned, but you keep moving forward anyway. One afternoon after finishing my shift, I came home and found an envelope in the mailbox. The return address made my stomach tighten. Columbus, Ohio, my mother's handwriting. I stood there at the end of the gravel driveway for a long moment before opening it. The paper inside was simple, just one page. No legal language, no demands, just a letter. I read it slowly. Emily, your father and I have spent the last few months thinking about everything that happened. I won't pretend we understand all of it, but I do know one thing now. We hurt you. When the house sold, it felt like we lost more than property. We lost our daughter. Your father hasn't said much about it, but I can see it weighing on him. Jason has started working full-time at a hardware store. He says it's the first steady job he's ever had. Maybe that's something good that came out of all this. I'm writing because I'd like to see you. No contracts, no expectations, just a visit. Love, Mom. I read the letter twice, then a third time. Daniel stepped out onto the porch behind me. Mail from home, he asked. I nodded and handed him the letter. He read it quietly. When he finished, he leaned against the porch railing beside me. What do you think? He asked. I watched the late afternoon sunlight stretch across the fields. I think she's trying, I said. And your dad? I gave a small smile. That might take longer, Daniel chuckled. Fair enough. We stood there for a few minutes in comfortable silence. Finally, he asked, Are you going to go? I thought about that carefully. For most of my life, going back home meant stepping into the same old roles. The responsible one, the one who fixes things, the one who gives up a little more. But things were different. Now I think I will, I said. Daniel nodded. Want company? Of course. 2 weeks later, Daniel and I drove back to Ohio. The trip felt different this time. The first time we left, it felt like escape. This time, it felt like closure. When we pulled into my parents' driveway, the house looked exactly the same as it always had. Same white siding, same maple tree in the yard, but something felt different. Maybe it was me. My mother answered the door. For a moment, she just stood there staring at me. Then she wrapped her arms around me and held on tight. I missed you, she whispered. I hugged her back. I missed you too. When we stepped inside, my father was sitting at the kitchen table. He looked older than I remembered, not dramatically, just heavier somehow. The kind of weight people carry when they've spent too long thinking about their mistakes. Jason was there too. He stood awkwardly when we entered. Hey, Em, he said. Hi, Jason. For a moment, none of us knew what to say. Finally, my father cleared his throat. You look well, he said. I am. He nodded slowly. Daniel shook his hand. Good to see you again, Frank. My father gestured toward the table. Sit down. We all did. The room felt quiet but not hostile, just careful. My mother poured coffee. Jason stared at his mug like it might contain the answers to everything. Finally, my father spoke. I suppose you're wondering why we asked you here. I met his eyes. I have a guess. He took a long breath. For years, your mother and I believed we were helping Jason. Jason shifted in his chair. But looking back, my father continued, We weren't helping him at all. We were protecting him from responsibility. No one interrupted. My father rubbed his hands together. And we expected you to carry the rest. The words hung in the air. It was the closest thing to an apology I had ever heard from him. Jason finally spoke. I should have said no when they asked you to sign the house over, he said. I looked at him. That would have been nice. He nodded. I'm trying to do things differently now. Hardware store, I asked. Yeah, do you like it? He shrugged. It's honest work. I smiled slightly. That's a good start. My mother wiped at the corner of her eye. I don't expect everything to go back to normal, she said softly. But I would like to have my daughter in my life again. I thought about that, about everything that had happened, about the years before it and the months since. Then I said something that surprised even me. We can start with visits. My mother nodded eagerly. That would mean a lot. My father looked relieved. For the first time in a long while, the tension in the room eased. It wasn't perfect, but it was honest. And sometimes that's the beginning of something better. A year has passed since the day my parents showed up with that contract. Sometimes I still think about that moment. The folder on the table, the pen in my hand, my father's voice telling me I owed the family. For most of my life, I believed that sentence. Family meant sacrifice. Family meant putting yourself last. And for a long time, I thought being the strong one meant quietly accepting whatever was asked of me. But strength turns out to mean something very different. Sometimes strength means walking away. Life in Franklin Hollow settled into a comfortable rhythm. The clinic became busier as word spread that a new nurse had come to town. Most days I saw the same familiar faces, Mr. Callahan with his stubborn blood pressure, Mrs. Wiggins who never remembered to take her arthritis medication unless I called to remind her. People here didn't rush through conversations. They talked about their grandchildren, their gardens, the weather. Sometimes they stayed a little longer than necessary just to have someone listen. For a nurse, that kind of community is a gift. Daniel's auto shop opened 6 months after we arrived. It wasn't much bigger than his old place in Columbus. 3 bays, a gravel parking lot, and a faded sign that read Harper's Garage. But the work was steady. Farm trucks, old pickup engines, occasionally a tractor from one of the nearby farms. Every evening, Daniel came home smelling like motor oil and sun-warmed metal. And every evening, he looked content. One night, we were sitting on the porch watching fireflies flicker across the yard when he asked me something. Do you ever regret it? I knew exactly what he meant. The house, the contract, everything that followed. I rocked slowly in the wooden chair. No, I said, not even a little. I thought about that honestly. I regret how long it took me to understand something. What's that? That love isn't supposed to feel like a debt. Daniel smiled. That's a good lesson. We sat there quietly for a while, the kind of quiet that feels peaceful instead of empty. My parents started visiting every couple of months. The first visit was awkward. The second was easier. By the third visit, my mother was bringing homemade pies again like she used to when I was a kid. Jason came along once, too. He had lost some weight and looked more relaxed than I remembered. Working regular hours had done something good for him. One afternoon. We were sitting at the kitchen table when he said something that stuck with me. You know, he said, losing that house might have been the best thing that ever happened to me. I raised an eyebrow. Really? He nodded. Yeah, it forced me to grow up. My father chuckled quietly. That lesson cost us quite a bit of money. Jason grinned. Worth it. For the first time in our lives, the 3 of us were talking like equals, not like roles in some old family script, just people. Eventually, my father apologized, not with big dramatic speeches. That wasn't his style. One evening, he and I were standing in the yard watching Daniel fix the fence along the creek. My father cleared his throat. I shouldn't have asked you to sign that contract. I looked at him. No, I said, you shouldn't have. He nodded slowly. We thought we were keeping the family together, and instead we almost broke it. He took a long breath. You handled it better than I deserved. I thought about the empty house, the long drive south, and the life we had built since then. I didn't handle it perfectly, I said, but I handled it honestly. My father nodded again, and that was enough. Every now and then, someone at the clinic asks how I ended up in Franklin Hollow. When they do, I usually give them the short version. My husband's from here, I say, which is true. But sometimes, especially when I'm talking to someone older who understands how families work, I tell them a little more. I tell them about the house, about the contract, about the moment I realized that being the strong one didn't mean giving everything away. And I tell them something else too. Families aren't perfect. Parents make mistakes. Children carry those mistakes longer than anyone realizes. But if people are willing to face the truth, sometimes things can still be repaired, not erased, but repaired. If you're listening to this story and something about it feels familiar, maybe a family expectation, maybe a sacrifice you've carried quietly for years, I hope you remember one thing. Love should never require you to lose yourself. Healthy families grow through honesty, responsibility, and respect. And sometimes the bravest thing a person can do is change the pattern. If this story meant something to you, feel free to share it with someone who might need to hear it. And if you enjoy thoughtful stories about life, family, and second chances, you're always welcome to come back and listen again. Because sometimes the stories we hear help us understand our own.